I'm Amanda, and I am working with NESCO to talk to you about how to can green beans. I have a little LLC called Hopefully Homesteading where I teach people some food preservation techniques. Today, I want to talk to you about how to water bath and pressure can using the NESCO Smart Canner. It has both of those functionalities, so we're going to make green beans in two ways. The first green bean that we're going to make is a water bath process, and we're going to be making dilled green beans. This time of year, you are going to notice green beans are on sale, and this is a great way to kind of capture some of the sale prices, or if you're a gardener, you might find yourself with an abundance of green beans, and you may want to do something different than eat them fresh or put them in the freezer. So canning them is a great way to preserve them and put them on the shelf for use later in the year when fresh green beans might be more expensive, or you might not have any available in your garden. And you can also add some interesting flavors to your beans, and that's what the dilly beans are going to be about. So for dilly beans, we have our green beans already washed, trimmed, and blanched, and I'll explain that in a second. And then we have our pickling brine that has been at a boil for 10 minutes and is now off the stove. We're going to be referencing recipes from the USDA canning guide that was put forth by the National Center for Home Food Preservation, and we're using section 4 where we're looking at Italian and snap beans pieces is the recipe that we're looking at. So if you're new to canning, I would encourage you to look at that free reference online. It'll offer you a really nice ability to get base information from a trusted and reliable source. Okay, so let's start with dilly beans. We have our jars washed and ready to go. We have our pickling brine ready and hot. We have our green beans that have been blanched and ready to get into our jars. One of the benefits of blanching your food before you put it into a canning process is that it will remove some of the trapped air from the food, causing it to be less likely to float in your jar, and it will preserve the color of your food a lot better than if you do what's called a raw pack method. So the color issue really is a matter of preference. If you don't mind having a color that dulls or changes over time, you're welcome obviously to do a cold pack, but I like to do a hot pack. And that will ensure that I'm getting a nice tight pack because I've removed some air from the beans as well as maintain the color. So we've got our jar. One piece of canning equipment that I really appreciate is a jar funnel. They make them in metal, plastic. This one has a silicone base, so it's collapsible, and I like that quite a bit. But we're going to take our jar funnel. I like to put a few beans directly into the jar before I my other herbs and spices in. So we're just going to get a few beans into the jar. Then our instructions call for a couple of cloves of garlic, really to taste. I like to have very garlicky beans, so I like to put 2 heads in. And then we're also going to put some fresh dill in. Get those pieces in there, and then keep going with adding your beans. So we're going to give our beans a snug pack and just keep adding beans here and there until you have a nice snug pack. And then we're going to be topping this with our pickling liquid that is a 1/2 inch. We're going to leave a 1/2 inch of head space. So we're going to get our pickling liquid in next. Okay, pickling liquid's going in. Excuse the mess, that's what the jar funnel's for. We're going to get our pickling liquid in, and then we're going to adjust the headspace one more time after we take out any bubbles that might be trapped in the jar between the green beans. Okay. You can get a fancy debubbling tool if you want to, and sometimes they'll even have a headspace measurement on there for you, but I will measure headspace by reference. I've canned enough that I recognize what a 1/2 inch headspace looks like, or at least to within an approximation that I feel comfortable with. So we're just going to debubble by going around. I'm just using a butter knife and giving a little push and a little wiggle here and there because we want to be able to pull out any bubbles that might be in there. And you may notice that after you debubble, your vinegar level or your water level is dropped. So I am top that up a little bit further. I know that the shoulder of the jar represents 1 inch from the top of the jar, so I'm going to go between the shoulder and the top of the jar to give me a 1/2 inch. This is a vinegar-based brine, so the likelihood of having any interference with a seal on this is pretty low, but out of good practice, I still always wipe the rim of the jar with a clean, damp rag. Use a new clean lid and give a turn. When you're tightening this down, you want there to be, again, a nice snug turn. What they usually recommend is spinning the band until it stops on its own and then give another 1/4 turn. The reason why you want it snug on the top without being super tight is because as this heats up in the canner, it is going to expand and you need some volume for that to push out. If you don't have enough headspace, it can cause problems with things getting trapped between the lid and the rim of the jar and cause seal failures. So 1 jar done, let's put it in the canner. The NESCO canner can hold 5 pints or 4 quarts. I like to do beans in pints, but you can certainly do them in quarts as well. Let's go on to the next one. So same thing, we're going to be getting our beans that have been blanched into the jar. Again, I like to put a few in and then add my fresh herbs and spices. This can be dill from your garden too. This can be garlic from your garden too. I really appreciate canning because it lets me preserve all the hard work that I do in my garden every year. Each year I try and add 1 item to my pantry that I would ordinarily buy in the store and grow it in my garden. And then fill my pantry for the year. Okay, so again, we're just giving like a nice snug pack here to our beans. Push them in. And then we are going to adjust our headspace after we top with vinegar. Okay. Let's debubble this guy using our kitchen knife. And give a push. Just going to give this rim a wipe. When you're filling your jars or washing your jars, it's really important to take a peek. Are there any chips or cracks along the mouth of your jar? Is there any pockets of air you can see after you've filled your jar? Is there any indication that there might be a crack or a bubble in the glass? If there is, you need to accommodate for that. Either if the jar is physically damaged, you need to make sure that you're disposing of it. If your ring doesn't have or has some rust on it, or if your lid gasket isn't intact for some reason, you just want to get rid of all of those and start with some new items. So again, give a turn, 1/4 tight, and then pop her in the canner. Let's get 1 more in there. Then we'll move on to just regular blanched green beans. So again, I like to have a few pieces in here. We're gonna pop our dill in. I like to use just the fronds, and we'll pop a couple pieces of that in, and then continue with the beans. Again, giving a little pack. When beans are blanched, they're pretty easy to get a nice snug pack on too. They've softened a little bit. And when you're canning, it's important to keep your processes clean. So in this case, we're going to be water bathing our dilly beans for 5 minutes, and we are going to be processing under pressure our blanched green beans in water for 20 or 25 minutes. I'll have to double check our reference. And during that heating process, the temperature is eradicating any pathogens or germs that might be causing problems for us. When we look at our canning processes, it's really important to know what acid content roughly is in your food? Are you trying to can a low acid food or a high acid food? Because that's going to change the process that you're using. And you might question, well, Amanda, you're telling me that we're going to do dilly beans in a water bath canner and we're going to do blanched green beans under a pressure canning process. And the reason that we can do that safely is because in the water bath canning process, we're acidifying our beans as they go into that. So what's going to happen is the acid will drive into the beans, thereby creating an environment where those kind of nasty garden pathogens like botulism could potentially be living in a spore state. And it'll prevent those spores from colonizing in the jar, building up in the jar. All right, that will pop in. So with our water bath process, we're going to make the dilly beans, and with our pressure canning process, we're going to make the blanched beans. We have our clean worm jar. We have a clean jarring funnel. We have our blanched beans that have been trimmed, snapped, and cleaned. And then we also have our jars, lids, all the things we need. We're ready to go. This is one of the easiest pressure canning processes that you can do because it just requires green beans, water, a pressure canner, and your time. You don't even have to add salt if you don't want to. That's one of the nice benefits of canning your own vegetables, is that you can control what you're putting in that product. So we have our clean worm jar. Because we're doing this in a pressure canning process that takes more than 10 minutes, we don't have to sterilize our jars, and that's according to the National Center for Home Food Preservation. They have a fantastic free guide that will teach you all about canning safely and how to discern between high acid foods, low acid foods, when you should be adding acid to products like tomatoes to kind of tip the scale into the water bathable section. And it also gives you a lot of really fantastic base knowledge. So we're going to be using section 4, which talks about canning processes for vegetables. Jar is clean. Beans are clean and blanched. I like to do a process that's called a hot pack, and that involves blanching your beans first and then putting them into the jars and putting them into your pressure canner. The reason that I like to use the hot pack as opposed to the raw pack method is because you'll retain color a little bit better with the hot pack process. And that really is a matter of preference. But the hot pack process also helps to drive air out of your green beans, and then you won't have as much floating in your jars and you'll be able to get a nice snug pack. So we have our beans. We're literally just going to fill the jars and top them with water. Even though we're topping this with water, it's still good practice to make sure that you're wiping down the rim of your jar. So we are just going to be giving these a little bit of a squish in. My hands are clean, my jars are clean, and we are just going to squish these in until we have a reasonable pack on them. Once we have our jars packed and we have space to leave a 1-inch head space on this jar, we're going to stop and we're going to top it with water. If you wanted to, now would be the time to put in some salt, but I prefer just to leave my beans unsalted. So we'll add some boiling water to the top of this and then we'll load it into our canner. Okay, so we have our water and we're going to fill our jar with water. An important step after you get this filled with water is debubbling and adjusting your headspace. You can debubble using a debubbling tool and check your headspace using a headspace tool that's on the back side of most debubblers, but I tend to eyeball headspace. I've been canning for a long time and I recognize that the shoulder of the jar is 1 inch from the rim of the jar. So I use that as an estimate and I kind of eyeball it. Once you have all your items in here and you've got your liquid in, you're going to just come around with your debubbling tool or handy dandy kitchen knife and just give it a poke and a wiggle. What we're trying to do is drive out any air bubbles that might be within the jar, and then we're going to take a look at the headspace again and see if we need to make an adjustment. And in this case, we can actually top it up Oh, I'm sorry, we want a 1-inch headspace. I'm gonna leave it alone. Before you put your rim on, again, even though this is just water that we're using in our process, it's a good idea to go ahead and wipe the rim. Part of the reason that you're doing that is to make sure that there isn't anything like particulate on the top that could cause a problem with sealing, but also you can be assessing for any chips or cracks in the sealing surface, which can cause problems. And it's probably a good idea before you put anything into a pressure canner to take a look and make sure that your jar is in good shape too. There aren't any bubbles in the glass, there aren't any streaks or cracks in the glass that could cause problems. The worst that's going to happen is it'll explode in your canner, and while that's not the end of the world, it's certainly not fun to open your can and find an exploded jar of chili or something like that. So we're going to put our lid on, we're going to get our ring, we're going to turn this down so that it just meets resistance, and then give it a 1/4 turn more, and I'm going to load it into the canner that we are going to be pressure canning with. So that's over here. All right, let's get the next jar full. Again, just blanched beans here, your preference of salt or without, giving a loose pack initially. I like to give a little shake down, catch any beans that escape, give it a little snug push, keep topping up until you have a 1-inch headspace for this particular process. With our dilly beans, we only need a 1/2-inch headspace, but we're leaving a 1-inch here. And as you're filling your jars, sometimes if you want to, you can leave them out and open so that if you just have a few beans left, you can top jars up with them instead of maybe overfilling one jar or something like that. You can kind of distribute them through the other jars. Okay, so we've got that packed up. Let's top up with water. And again, whoop, this was at a boil for about 10 minutes before we're adding it. Once we get this filled, oh man, I'm making a mess. Once we get this filled, we'll check for our headspace after we debubble. And we're just going to push stuff down again a little bit. Make sure you give a wipe. Get a nice clean lid on there, nice clean ring, a turn, and load your canner. All right, let's move on to getting our water in the canner. All right, so we have our canner loaded, and we're going to top it with 2 quarts of water per the instructions from NESCO. I like to use hot water when I'm doing this and feel like it just kind of gives a jump start. All right, we're going to do the same thing to the other canner. After we've got the water in, we're just going to close it, give it a turn, and make sure for this process, because it will be a pressure process, that we have our dial set to exhaust when we start. All right, we have our canners loaded, and we're going to get ready to process them. So remember, we did blanched beans in water, and we did dilly beans in a pickling brine that uses a 5% acidity white vinegar. So because we are acidifying one product, the dilly beans, we're able to use a water bath or steam function on the canner to process those. Again, the acid balance is the critical factor for determining if you need to use a water bath process or a pressure process. So for our dilly beans, which are utilizing vinegar to drive acidity, we're going to simply hit water bath, and we're going to set our timer for 5 minutes and hit start. We have the exhaust valve set to exhaust. We're just going to let this spin, and eventually it's going to give us that timer. when it's reached the temperature that it needs to. We're going to Once it reaches temperature, our countdown of 5 minutes will start. And when we get done with our 5-minute processing time, we're just going to turn off the canner, unplug it, and allow it to vent naturally for 1 hour. All right, so now we have our canners loaded and we're going to set up for our blanched green beans in water. Again, this is going to have to be a pressure process because the green beans in water have had no adjustment to their acidity. They are a low acid product, and as a result, we're going to need a higher temperature to kill any vegetative spores that might be living in our jar right now. So that requires pressure and time. We're going to be setting this up to a high pressure process for 20 minutes according to the USDA guide. So with the NESCO canner, we're just going to hit high and we're going to set our time to 20 minutes and then hit start. It'll start cycling, and once it's reached time to vent, it will go from this spinning dial to E10, and that E10 is actually a 10-minute countdown, and the 10-minute countdown is critical for appropriate venting of your canner. Whether it's a stovetop canner or an electric canner, that 10-minute vent time is critical. We're going to make sure that our vent is set to exhaust, and we're going to wait for our 10-minute timer to go off before we flip it to airtight and let it finish its process. All right, our green beans are done. So let's open up our canner. We've given it an hour to vent, and we know that we can open it safely because the pin in the back has dropped. That would prevent you from being able to open the canner if there were still pressure in the canner. Okay, so we're just going to open it up. When you're opening your canner, I like to stand to the back of it or off to the side because you'll notice when we open it, some steam comes out, and a steam burn is no fun. So just give that a second, give it an open, and you'll see our green beans in there. So I don't really care to use the jar lifters that come in canning kits. You certainly can use these, but I don't care for them. Oh, we're hearing some pinging already. I don't care for them. They tend to feel a little unstable in my hand. So I actually use an oven glove, and that way I can have a really good hold of my jar. Take a look at those beautiful dilly beans. I can get a really good hold of my jar and bring those hot jars down onto a tea towel on my counter. I don't like to put them directly onto the countertop, and I would encourage you not to put them directly onto your countertop because you can actually experience some thermal shocking, and that is a hot mess that you don't want to deal with. So you're going to space them out on a tea towel and just allow those to cool to room temperature over the next 8 to 12 hours, potentially up to 24, listening for pinging if you can. And you'll notice that as your canner comes down to room temperature, there's going to be some steam coming off. So I like to leave mine open for a little bit, let it come down in temperature slightly, and then I'll just dispose of the water.